I want to add just one thing. If you think back to April 2010, when all of us got sworn in as council members at our first meeting, we were sworn in by Justice Ron Roby, who was also the former director of the Department of Water Resources for first-term Governor Jerry Brown. His chief deputy is Dr. Jerry Merrill, who was this is the notion, the once and future king, was then and is now involved in the issues. And so people go from decade to decade with effect.
Oh, it's worse than that. He worked for me when I was over there.
He being Dan Ray.
Yeah.
Taught me how to shave.
In a subterranean refuge that we... Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come over today. And while I do want to talk about the governance, Chapter 7 of the BDCP, I'd be happy to answer any other questions anyone has about our work. And I also want to say that for the long as I've been working on this, we've had at least about a bi-weekly call, first with Joe Grindstaff and now with Chris, and we often meet to try to see if there are any interactions between what you're doing and what we're doing with BDCP, and try to make them as harmonious as possible. And that's been a really good relationship. And mostly I see Phil on panels. It seems like we give a lot of joint presentations, and Randy, and so it's I think been a good relationship. Well, governance of the BDCP structure is maybe of the greatest interest to the most number of interest groups. We've had a variety of working groups at BDCP on a whole myriad of subjects, but governance is the one that we've had the most meetings of and the best attendance. We often get 30, 40 different interest groups showing up to see how this thing is going to be governed. And the reason is, of course, who's in charge. If there is a facility built, if there's going to be a lot of habitat implemented, who's actually in charge of that, and how does it fit in with our permits, our state and federal HCP and NCCPA permits. I will say that the version of Chapter 7, which is the governance chapter, that's now on the website that you've been given a copy of, I'm sure, has been vetted very heavily with the major interest groups, the water contractors, NGOs, the Delta counties, and many other agencies within the Delta who show up always at our meetings, and the state and federal fish and wildlife and water agencies. And so, not to say it can't be changed, it will be changed, I'm sure, but based on public comment. But it is now I think, not a bad balance between the interest of all these different groups. And we're looking for changes to make it better, obviously, but I think it has been receiving a lot of attention from those groups. The hardest thing we had to do in crafting this chapter was to develop something the federal government could live with. And if you read through the chapter, you'll see a dozen or more references that say nothing in this chapter takes away the power of the federal government. That's basically what they want to say, and we have to, of course, accede to that, but it makes governance a little bit tricky, and you'll see if you read through it how often that phrase or something like it recurs, because this is very much a state-federal project. The way the governance works is actually pretty simple, and maybe not dramatically different from a version that we had even a year ago. That is, we have two bodies. One's called the Authorized Entity Group, and that consists of the water agencies, the Bureau of Reclamation, DWR, and possibly the water contractors. That isn't certain yet, but the current version shows them as a member of that group. Then there is the Permit Oversight Group, and that's the fish agencies, basically the three that Dan mentioned, the two federal and one state. And originally we had this set up as a unified group, and it became pretty apparent that the roles of the two groups were pretty different. And actually, Director Chuck Bonham from Fish and Game suggested this current structure, which was a really good idea. And the two are roughly equal but have very different responsibilities. The AEG, the Authorized Entity Group, directs the implementation office. The program manager would report to that group. And they are in charge of actually implementing the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. They have permit requirements. There'll be hundreds and hundreds of permit requirements. There'll be hundreds probably of biological goals and objectives, and they have to carry it out. And that means implement the habitat work, do water quality monitoring. We have 23 different conservation measures, and so they'll have to carry that out. But the Permit Oversight Group is really a co-equal partner, and their role is it being carried out the way the permit says? Are we actually implementing this thing in a way that not only carries out the individual actions? We have a lot of individual actions like, taking old boats out of delta channels to reduce predator habitat and a whole variety of things like that, plus, of course, the habitat itself. But is it achieving the biological goals and objectives? This whole plan is about achieving biological goals and objectives. And so they will monitor very closely whether that's happening. And where the rubber meets the road, in a sense, is in adaptive management. That's where the Science Board focused most of their attention. If everything is going great, everyone will be happy. Well, we know that that won't happen. Some things won't achieve what we want them to achieve. And so we'll have to have adaptive management. We have a very elaborate adaptive management structure. Somewhat in this chapter, when you read it, you might go, is that all there is? Well, no. In Chapter 3, there's a very extensive discussion, or will be a very extensive discussion, of how adaptive management actually works in Chapter 3.6. That isn't in the implementation structure. It's a whole separate process, and we view it as part of the project. The reason it's in our Chapter 3 is that's where the project is described and how it would be implemented. And adaptive management is part of the project. So you have to read the two together. And Chapter 3 and Chapter 3.6 specifically are not out yet, but they will be released next month, so you'll be able to read the whole thing in context. I want to go through a few of the duties of the Permit Oversight Group. A lot of people say, gee, the fish agencies are not actually operating this thing, and will they really have a role, or will they simply be, brushed aside in some way by the operators? And so here are a few of the things they actually have to do in their specific tasks. They have to approve changes in conservation measures through the adaptive management program, and that's a huge role. Adaptive management in this project will be decisions that affect billions of dollars of infrastructure and could cost many, many millions of dollars to implement, depending on what has to be done to get closer to achieving the goals and objectives. And so the power to approve, along with the authorized entity group, the water operators, is a very important role, and we don't want to underemphasize that. And they will have an intimate role through their individual agencies in the adaptive management team. And so the adaptive management team is joint with the water agencies and the fish agencies. So they work together on that. They also will have decision-making in real-time operations. Real-time operations simply means, we've got a slug of fish coming down the river, and, even though the criteria say we should divert X, we think that this slug needs a different kind of management. We want to back off. We want to pump earlier. Actually operating in real time to make the project work better. They also have very major input into staff selection, so that the program manager, the science manager have to be vetted with the fish agencies before they're actually chosen by the water agencies. They are going to be reviewing the Delta Operations Plan, the annual budget, and have essentially approval power. It doesn't quite say that, but that's really what they have there. They have to review the annual reports. They're involved day to day in this thing in a really big way. And even though they're not actually directing the program manager, they have a tremendous role to play in directing the science manager through the adaptive management team. So I think there is a pretty good role for them. Regarding the adaptive management program, I did review the comments that we received from the Science Board, and we're going to send a note back to them. Mostly what the note says is, you raised some good points. We want to work with you on them. We're not done with that at all. 3.6 may come out, but it's really just a draft. And so we want to work with them, with Peter, and with the whole board to try to make that better. It is very delicate. Implementing adaptive management in this program, as I said, will be a multi-million-dollar decision, not just in terms of changing monitoring, but it could be massive shifts in the program if it's not working right, an expenditure of money that instead of a particular kind of habitat might conceivably go to water purchase. Very important decisions that will have to be made. And we want them to be made based on science, but we also have to recognize that they'll have impacts on water consumers throughout the state. So they're not just a scientific experiment. They are critical to the way the water users actually receive water. They will be. One of the issues that's not resolved, as I mentioned, is will the water contractors themselves be permittees? We've received a request from the water contractors saying we want to be permittees. And when we talked to the fish agencies, they said, well, no, we got to look at your permit application and see whether they really are undertaking activities that require them to be permittees under the Endangered Species Act, state and federal. And until they see a final application and a final plan, and probably the EIR as well, although the plan's more critical here, they will not commit one way or the other. This frustrates the water contractors who would like to solve that right now, and also some of the NGOs who think they should not be permittees. But the fish agencies have that power, and we simply have to be patient and wait and see what comes out of that. But it is a very important issue to a lot of people. I did want to comment on the Stakeholder Council as well. The Science Board in their draft report questioned the need for the Stakeholder Council, and that's probably because they haven't had to meet with them a whole lot. But maybe if they met with them, they'd even be less enthusiastic. But the people in the Delta especially need a voice and a forum in this program. We cannot try to implement it in a way that ignores their concerns in any way and doesn't give them a real voice in the process. Now, they have different thoughts, frankly, among the various interest groups in the Delta about what their role really should be here, and I've heard a lot of different views. But in any case, the Stakeholder Council is very populated with the Delta counties, the farm bureaus, the reclamation districts, the people who really care about on the ground how this program gets implemented. And so we would advocate pretty strongly to keep the Stakeholder Council. And it may not be as strong as everybody would like, but at least it's a very visible public forum, and they would review everything: proposed adaptive management changes, changes in the budget, staffing, all kinds of things that they would care about. We would run through the Delta Stakeholder Council. We also have a subcommittee proposed there, a technical subcommittee that could work with our modelers to look at things like adaptive management changes and see whether they meet the criteria they care about and whether they're scientifically valid from their point of view, and they do have a point of view on that. A lot of the people in the Delta have extraordinarily good modeling capabilities, for example, and they want to run our data through their models. The Stakeholder Council will be one way to do that. This project, and it's not just in governance, I want to go back to something I mentioned earlier, is a very delicate balance of the state and federal governments. There has never been a truly joint state-federal project. Now, people will point to San Luis and say, well, isn't San Luis, yeah, we own part, they own part. And what about the canal? Well, yes, so the state operates the canal. But in some ways, San Luis is almost two different projects glued together. This one is not. This is an integrated project. We've never done that. The financing challenges in doing something with the federal government, which has a completely different way of looking at water projects than we in the state do, is the hardest challenge of all in this whole project. And in governance, we're trying to build them in, and you'll see references to decision-making officials so that someone in the governance structure from the federal government will have the power to spend federal money. No, they have to check in Washington, but they will have that power. We've never had that kind of integration before, and it's the most challenging part of the project. Finally, in that vein, we would ask the state and federal governments to prepare an annual water operations plan so that there is, under the Coordinated Operating Agreement, a specific publicly visible, publicly disclosed and commented on operations plan every year so that all the stakeholders and the fish agencies could actually see, what the plan is to operate the project for the coming year. These are some of the highlights, and I don't want to respond to you'll probably hear more about the Independent Science Board comments, but these are some of the highlights of governance, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, but also any questions about BDCP that you have as well.
Randy.
Sure. Jerry, thanks for coming. I want to compliment you on Chapter 7. I thought it was very well done, and obviously a lot of time went into evaluating all the different responsibilities that governance will assume if the project moves forward. And there were a lot of connections to other agencies and the Delta Science Program and so on and so forth. You're probably aware that as a part of developing the Delta Plan, our Delta Science Program is also developing a science plan for the Delta. And we hope that that will be a useful tool to inform others about this concept of one Delta, one science, contributing to better communication, better cooperation among all the different entities doing whatever they do constructively in the Delta. So in that vein, can you describe in a little more detail how you would envision under the governance structure of the BDCP, how it would interact with the Delta Science Program?
Yeah, the way we treat science, I think, is evolving pretty rapidly right now, and part of that is driven by the litigation over the biological opinions that's going through the courts right now and down in Fresno, I guess. The water contractors and the NGOs both feel that the process is opaque, that it's black box, something comes out, but they don't know how it came out or why it came out, and so there's dissatisfaction from both sides. What we want to do, if we can, either in a settlement or remand of the biological opinions, or perhaps separately, it's not critical that it be done in that context, although that's kind of pushing us, is to make it more of an open process. The regulatory part of science here is really the agencies tell us what to do, which is fine, that's their role, but the way they get there is not very satisfying, and if you're following the current dispute over, smelt and so on, it's a very big deal. We need, it's not quite done. I mean, Ren Lohefner from Fish and Wildlife Service has spent a huge amount of time, and Will Stell from NOAA and Chuck Bonham on this. It's not quite done. When we have it, and I think it will be done soon, though, and it is evolving, people have comments, we need to take that new process that we hope is going to be transparent and allow the regulators to have other people participate, not in setting the regulations, but in seeing how they're developed. Then we need to merge that into BDCP. We really haven't yet. We have a science process, we have a science manager, we have adaptive management plan, and so on, but we don't have that broader science outlook of regulation, which is really the one that people care about the most, well integrated into this. So we need to work with the federal agencies and Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife, of course, and with the Science Board to tune that up. It's not done. We do have a science chapter, but you wouldn't find it very satisfying, and I hope it doesn't come out the current version. It's not very satisfying. So this is probably, of all the things we're doing outside of maybe finance, the hottest area of activity and of progress. So we want to work really closely with the Science Board, with IEP, with the state and federal agencies to develop something that the interest groups find to be credible. I think that's the biggest challenge. It isn't a challenge of having the scientists think that it's credible. Scientists are pretty happy with some of these regulations, but the interest groups don't feel they're sufficiently science-based. So it's evolving. I think we should get back to you. You'll be hearing from the Science Board about it. But it's a very hot topic for discussion, and you will see eventually a chapter that deals with this, but it's not done yet. We're really working on it hard, though.